So before we get started, just know that this game is something that a lot of you probably didn't think I would ever talk about on multiple levels, and I can guarantee that some of the takes I have in this will be the exact opposite of what a lot of fans of the game think about. Just know that this is going to be a ride. Hold on tight, boys, because we're going into that wild pale yonder.
There is nothing, only warm primordial blackness.
Like I lied before.
You're conscious for men,
like I did at LCS.
The remaining
no larger than a
I
single
have to
grain
lie
of mold.
tribunal.
It
You
wasn't
don't have to do anything
I was
anymore.
never like I lied. It was 100. Like I did.
I don't know what
The enemies of humanity who took this city.
It's like
I represent their adversary.
And for the record, no, I didn't do it.
Do you remember the scent of your childhood?
Capitalism is the worst economic system, except for all the others. That's a quote from Winston Churchill. And really, it's sort of a thesis statement for this big-ass video. You see, Disco Elysium is a game that is pretty hard to describe. Not that it's hard to summarize, it's a CRPG created by a bunch of Estonians who moved to England. It's about a schizophrenic detective trying to keep his mental state together while weaving through a dangerous conspiracy in a slum city, beaten down by a failed communist revolution and horrid crime rates with a noticeably disco aesthetic to it. Disco Elysium does whatever it can to stand out from the crowd and set itself apart from a lot of other CRPGs. Instead of dealing with moral alignments like something like Baldur's Gate or Pathfinder would have, you have voices in your head pushing you into different vices or temptations, whether it's doing drugs, drinking, smoking, hitting on women, stealing money from people, to outright joining a political ideology. The protagonist is beset on all sides by distractions and roadblocks that keep trying to pull him away from his job, and it's your job to somehow balance all of this and find the truth behind what's going on in the shithole known as Revachol. It's not easy by any means. You have corrupt union workers acting as glorified gangsters, a corporate negotiator just barely holding on to control of a pissed off mercenary death squad, a mysterious woman who seems to know way more about what's going on than she's willing to say, and Harry's own crippling mental illness. Disco Elysium is a game that has gathered a very substantial and very loyal following. People fell in love with the world, the art style, the writing, having extremely fleshed out characters that all have different layers to who they are as individuals, an art direction that really stands above the crowd that sticks in your brain for a very long time, as well as a world with a dense history you just naturally want to learn more about. On top of all this, you have an open-ended RPG that allows for pretty much any solution to a problem. If it works, then it works. So you're encouraged to poke around for hidden details or things that can affect the dice rolls, some of which can be massive and unlock entirely new branches of dialogue that can completely shift your perspective on a character or an event. Hell, some of the dice rolls can be so massive you can sequence break large chunks of the game. Really, if you know what you're doing, you can beat Disco Elysium in less than 10 hours. There's only a few canon events you need to do in order to reach the ending. You're not encouraged to do this, since you need larger context to tie everything together, and you can miss out on massive reveals or story threads because you rush through things, but you are allowed to do it. And if you know what threads really matter to the investigation or not, you'll get an ending that's still pretty satisfactory. Regardless, don't rush things. You have a lot more time than you think you do. The maximum amount of days that can pass in-game are about 10. I don't know if it goes any further than that, that's just what I've heard, and I've never needed to go that far, and usually beat the game in about 5 days or so. This most recent playthrough for the video took me about 8, but there's a reason for that I'll talk about later. All you have to know for now is that Disco Elysium was the brainchild of Studio Zom, a collection of Estonians who moved to England with a grand idea in their brain, to pitch their idea for a massive tabletop RPG world with a video game, Disco Elysium. Now, a lot of this feels kinda weird to talk about, since Disco Elysium became a massively talked about game, not just for the critical acclaim going down as one of the greatest CRPGs ever made, but also the shenanigans the developers got themselves into, none of which exactly positive. Yeah, Disco Elysium is a game mired by controversy, more than one. For one, when the game won an award during the 2019 Game Awards, one of the writers, Helen Perry, however the fuck you say her name, took time to thank Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels during the speech.
So, I'd like to thank all the great people that came before us. Ilja
Repin, Vladimir Mayakovsky, Viktor Tsoi,
and Marx and Engels for providing us the political education. Thank you.
Something that game journals loved when they weren't busy covering up sexual abuse at Blizzard or putting on buck teeth and squinting eyes for Persona reviews.
It is time of gamer! It's X-Play!
This would still be funny if the people involved didn't start calling their own audience racist 10 years later. Or if Japanese developers didn't come out and admitted they felt sabotaged in the Western market by journalists pushing the Japan is so weird talking point. Series like Xenoblade still receive criticism for being too Japanese, which is a completely insane standard that the general public is only now realizing is proof the side-calling gamers bigots were themselves over-the-top parodies of human beings this whole time.
But the rest of the audience took that as a sign that the game was blatantly biased towards communism and Marxism, something I believed for years until a friend insisted I actually sit down and play it. And there's still a very large chunk of people that actively refuse to play Disco Elysium because of this stunt. Something you can't really blame them for. It's essentially telling a Jew to sit down and play a video game after one of the developers made a speech praising Adolf Hitler. Shocker, some parts of the world had very bad experiences with Marxism and communism, which is especially ironic considering the dev team's heritage. Estonia was not treated well by the Soviets under any definition, a sentiment that does slip into the game on more than a few occasions, but we're going to talk about that towards the end. There's a reason you can't wear a Che Guevara shirt in certain neighborhoods in Miami, just to put it lightly. Socially, it may not be on the same level, but there are people that view communism and its symbols as bad memories of famines, death squads, and oppression. To them, the Nazis and the Soviets were the same people, just one was to the east and the other was to the west. I mention all of this because this really painted the game in a much more different light than it really should have been, to the point that's completely tainted any ability to talk about the game objectively and led to some urban legends and outright scary misinterpretations of story elements, something that can be very revealing about the person who sees it that way. And the best part is how much of this is rendered ironic by the eventual closure of Studio Zom, conquered by their publisher in a hostile takeover, all the developers fired, and the lead developer outright locked in an insane asylum. No, I'm not kidding. For a while, nobody had any clue what happened. They assumed it was a situation very common in gaming. A greedy publisher wanted a bigger slice of the pie, so they fucked the people over. Something actually kind of fitting considering the supposed communist sympathies in the game. But that's not what happened. At least not fully. A documentary by the channel People Make Games was released with the intention of digging into what killed Studio Zom, and some of the reveals were extremely interesting. I highly recommend you all sit down to watch this documentary. It's really revealing about the actual personalities involved with Disco Elysium, and still something that fits the game like a glove, just not the way the communists think. To the point they have had some seriously pathetic attempts to debunk the documentary, even though there are word-for-word emails and transcripts and interviews that really don't paint them as anything other than insane. You see, the dev team wasn't actually that political. They were left-leaning, sure, I mean they were European, by American standards everyone on that continent's a lefty, but by no means were they all singing Solidarity Forever during meetings. In fact, there were shitloads of infighting, with the project lead himself, the creator of Disco Elysium's world, being painted as an egotistical, hypocritical, pretentious thief, preaching about the values of Marxism all while refusing to do any work and outright stealing credit for things other members on the team did, to the point his best friend, one of the lead writers for the game, admitted that he really should have been fired for what he did, and this is on top of downright shady events that happened with the studio's money.
Just before the game came out, that includes a line from Robert estimating that he individually is responsible for about half of the game's total word count.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah, there was also a claim that Robert, Rostov, and Helen had kind of checked out of their responsibility. Well, not kind of. The language is pretty direct. That they'd stopped working for almost 2 years while still being paid at the studio. But as someone who is on the writing team who continued to work on Final Cut, does that sound fair? What was your read on that?
I'd say that's semi-fair because yes, after we released Disco on 15th October 2019. After that, the first 3-4 months were complete hangover. Like everybody was so tired from. I think at some point Robert was supposed to start pre-production or like at least concepting of on the sequel. Yep. And in some degree, he definitely did that. He wrote like a bunch of new skills, but it's a thing where you can't say that no work was done. That would be false. Some work was done, but the question is, how, like, is it the acceptable amount? Because like especially if you look at it from through the eyes of someone outside the writing team, then it might look absurd. Like it might look that, guys, it's been years and you haven't done anything.
As stated, you guys really need to sit down and watch this documentary. It says a lot about the dev team and their true stances on things. Something that is just beautifully ironic, considering the game and the reputation it's built over the years.
The best part of the whole situation is the fact Kurvitz was accused of employee abuse and outright conspiring to steal the source code for Disco Elysium with the intention of keeping it hostage to get petty vengeance against other members in the company. And a sense of ownership, seeing himself as the only true owner of the IP, despite being an avowed communist, meaning by his own philosophy, the IP no longer belongs to him alone, and instead belongs to everyone. He even wrote an entire novel all about his love of communism ideology, trying to force it into the canon of the game, despite it causing major plot holes and dumbing the story down to be the exact opposite of what was intended, turning a game about the dangers of ideology and extremism into all about how everyone just isn't loyal enough to the political route Kurvitz likes the most, making it into a literal magic deus ex machina.
If you just listen to the zeitgeist about Disco Elysium, you'd think it's some pretentious Chinese room-style walking simulator, a masturbatory exploration of why communism is so great and never killed anybody, and everything is the capitalist's fault. In truth, no, Disco Elysium is not like that at all. In fact, knowing about the infighting in the studio makes certain moments and characters all the more enlightening, especially about the philosophy they're supposedly so in love with. But I'll talk about all this later. For now, let's just give a basic introduction to what it's like to play Disco Elysium. You have the very basic mechanics, dialogue trees that lead to deeper trees, a clothing system that only really works to add modifiers to your various stats, a stat system that affects different ways that protagonists can approach the investigation, and not just basic stuff like strength, charisma, intelligence. No, these are all different aspects of his personality. His aggression, impulse control, addictive personality traits, empathy for others. It's a much more psychological profile than a D&D style stat breakdown. Each of the stats even has flavor text describing how speccing into each trait affects Harry, how they impact his body and mind, and possible roleplay options. You can make a Jack Reacher style Harry, someone intelligent and strong but has trouble interacting with human beings. On the other hand, you have options for a Steve Brule Harry, not very smart, not very charismatic, but he stumbles into outright otherworldly events. That's something to mention for later, by the way. You can go full Sherlock Holmes, cocaine addiction and all, Miami Vice style super cop, or just a complete fuck up and sleep outside because you waste all your money on booze. Hell, you can even edit your save file to max out all traits, and this is actually a playstyle the game addresses. It's not just some god playthrough, it has its own set of drawbacks, constantly barraged by skill checks since there are tons of dice rolls. The game doesn't even tell you about rolling in the background. It's essentially a schizophrenia simulator, dealing with the endless voices in your head telling you to do things, because these aren't just advisors offering their own solution to a situation. They have their own share of biases and bad fucking ideas, to the point they can get downright scary. You get the point. Disco Elysium is very unique in how it tackles role-playing, but you might have noticed there's a certain mechanic I haven't talked about yet, combat. That's because there is none. Instead of doing something like Fallout or Arcanum where they have clunky, simple combat systems that completely rely on dice rolls, Disco Elysium just rips them out. It's essentially a visual novel. The only combat you get are dice rolls for specific choices, and they act more like story moments than anything. Personally, I think that's fine. A lot of CRPGs struggle with balancing their combat, and usually are super clunky and easy to break or have insane difficulty spikes. You can tell a lot of CRPGs see combat as an afterthought and want to focus more on dialogue and story, the larger world building. Planescape Torment has a really small amount of combat to it, and focuses much more on dialogue puzzles and learning about the setting than anything else. Of course, you also have games like Divinity and Baldur's Gate 3, which have fleshed out combat systems that are fun to interact with, so it's not like you have to choose between combat or story. Also, a lot of JRPGs also manage to have good stories and really fun combat systems. Xenoblade, Final Fantasy, Persona, stuff like that. But Disco Elysium does make the choice and dedicates fully to being a story game. Everything you do in some way revolves around various conversations you have with characters in the game. Whether it unlocks more dialogue options, applies modifier to dice rolls, or reveals a character is lying to you. This is a walking and talking talking game, something that hinges on the writing. If it can't grip you, then this is just a pretentious dreck of a game sucking up to games journalists, the feeble tantrum of the games are art crowd. You're not completely wrong, but at the same time Disco Elysium does have some really good writing. The story is very engaging with a lot of mystery and twists, and layers to its themes that allow the player to come to their own conclusions on the story. It's a fearless game, being very upfront about what it's saying, and willing to put forth ideas that no corporate game would ever attempt in a million years. The characters can be likable, hateable, they can annoy the piss out of you, or they can send a chill up your spine, but at the end of the day, they are memorable. They focused 100% on the story and managed to live up to that idea. It's a good story, to put it simply, and you can tell you're in for something special just from the intro. Now, before we get any further, I'm putting up a spoiler warning for Disco Elysium. This is a mystery game, all focusing on a central crime. Please sit down and play Disco Elysium before going any further. There's so much to the game that you'd be missing on the entire point of a detective game just from having the plot spoon-fed to you. You won't regret it. Plus, you can develop your own interpretation of the game, so don't let me spoil what could potentially be something completely different to you. Fuck you! So the actual plot of Disco Elysium is really simple. A mercenary acting as a security guard was murdered in the downtrodden city of Revachol, lynched up in a tree and left to rot by some more militant members of a union, the Hardy Boys. Harry Dubois, the protagonist, arrives to Revachol to investigate. He's a highly decorated officer with hundreds of solved cases under his belt, so it seems like this is a no-brainer he can solve in a weekend. Except Harry has had a few bad days. For 6 years straight, unable to get over a nasty breakup with his fiancée, and dealing with growing burnout at the same time. Harry suffers a complete mental breakdown, going on a massive bender, attempting suicide more than once, and eventually drinking so hard he develops complete amnesia. Not just that he forgets who he is as a person, but he forgot all of reality. He doesn't know where he is, what anything is, and now has to solve the case with his partner Kim Kitsuragi, who is basically just forced to play babysitter to a rambling madman Harry is left as. So right from the get-go, Disco Elysium sets itself up to be a very interesting mystery. The game revolves not just around dealing with the various factions of Revachol, but Harry's psychology. There's a reason the various voices in Harry's head are such a prevalent entity in the game, because they're the ruins of Harry's mind scrambling to take control of him now that he's completely amnesic, and depending on which one you listen to, Harry can become all sorts of an individual, not just politically, which is what everyone focuses on, but just who he is as a man. You can become convinced that the world is ending and he's a prophet sent to warn humanity of its coming demise. He can think he's a fictional super detective and the books written about the character are chronicles of his adventures. A psychic cop part of the remote viewers division, it's totes a real thing, promise. An artist desperate to paint his masterpiece, or just a guy who finally gets his shit together and does his fucking job. Disco Elysium has a lot of options, and you can mix and match all of these. Picking one road doesn't necessarily lock you out of others. In fact, there's some pretty hilarious scenes when you throw two contradicting philosophies together. Disco Elysium has a good finger on the pulse of what players want to see, and as a result, you get hundreds of hours of replayability. It's not possible to see everything in a single playthrough. You can get quite a bit, but specific routes and their ending require commitment. This is on top of the fact that with passive dice rolls, you can end up going through playthroughs that all feel distinct from each other. That's not to say the game is infinite, not at all, but you will see things differently in each playthrough, so don't be afraid to get creative. This is a game all about expression, how you express yourself in the game and how you solve the mystery. Harry, in particular, is one of the best compromises between the two styles of an RPG protagonist. I've talked about this before, but RPGs tend to fall into two archetypes with their protagonists. Pre-written characters with a set backstory, and you make choices that are essentially in character to who they are as an individual in the world, or complete blank slates that you fully imprint onto and choose every detail of who they are. It's essentially the difference between something like Fallout New Vegas or Baldur's Gate 3 and Deus Ex or Mass Effect. Disco Elysium is actually a balance of these two. Harry is a pre-written character. He has a set backstory and history in the story, but at the same time, he is completely open to you to roleplay. You can choose every detail of his personality, what his beliefs, his politics, even some details you wouldn't see coming are. You can't play as anyone except Harry, but the options you have as Harry are almost infinite. You can imprint whatever you want onto him, and interpret who exactly he is as a man how you see fit. It's one of the best aspects of the game, coming up with your own version of Harry and seeing it through to the end. Personally, I love the psychic cop route, speccing into the supernatural skills and having Harry be the schizo that can talk to the city. Everyone else calls him crazy. On some level, Harry himself thinks he's crazy, but at the end of the day, he's capable of things no one can explain rationally. It's great, especially when you learn about certain aspects of the setting that show that he may not be completely wrong. Still, this is just what I like for my playthroughs. Others have their own styles, and they can be just as engaging. and you might stumble into your own details that I didn't see because I just didn't get the roles for it. That's not to say Disco Elysium is going to be a completely different game each time you play, more that it's going to help show different sides to different people. Some people view this game as a biting satire to ideology and politics as a whole, others think it's just a shameless love letter to communism and condemning the fact human nature leads to its failure, others just want to talk to a stick bug, who is a very good boy. The whole point, and how I see the game as a whole, is this. Disco Elysium is a Rorschach test. Depending on how you interpret elements of the game and how you view the story, it can reveal a lot about the individual playing it. The Fallout New Vegas comparison from earlier extends to more than just gameplay. New Vegas handles its story in a very similar way, to the point I wouldn't be surprised if the developers took some inspiration for Disco Elysium. I mean, playing an amnesiac, waking up in the middle of a tense political struggle, and brewing war is a little too close not to mention, and just like New Vegas, it sets up each faction with its own history and culture, the ups and downs, some representatives of the ideology, and some role in the plot, some larger than others. Once again, this is why you want to explore around, because you'd be surprised how crucial certain characters were to the whole puzzle. Disco Elysium manages to show each ideology pretty fairly. Sure, you can argue that some get more shit than others, I mean fascism is a complete shitpost run, but you kinda go in knowing that. It's funny as hell watching Harry blame literally every problem in Revachol on foreigners, especially since if you want to get technical, he's not completely wrong. I mean, the Coalition are technically a collection of foreigners, but the point is that there's joke runs and more serious ones where you can actually sit down and think about what's being said. It's why I called the game a Rorschach test, because the conclusions you come to for each road will stand out because of your own personal belief system. And what conclusion did I have on the game and what it's saying? Well, this is where things get a little spicy. I said before that the general fan base of Disco Elysium view it as a love letter to communism and Marxism, and discusses the tragedy of how it always fails. Sure, that element is sort of there, but I saw the story in almost the complete opposite direction. It has downright scathing criticisms of communism, to levels that go beyond here's some flaws about our own ideology. The cope among the commie fanbase is that it's how you know the game was made by real communists, because they were willing to criticize the ideology so harshly, which is such an obvious spin and attempt at damage control that pretty much anyone can see the bullshit for what it is. This is why I brought up the studio infighting in the beginning, because some scenes feel especially bitter and like they're telling somebody fuck you.
Rise and shine, comrade. It's time to get to work. Despite all the thinking you've been doing, only 0.0001% of communism has been built. It's too great a task to undertake alone. You're going to have to get organized. Your level of personal upkeep is irrelevant. All that matters is your commitment to building the World Republic. You must seek out your revolutionary brothers and sisters. Find out how much communism they've built. Then, together, maybe you'll be able to build as much as 0.0002% of communism. But it won't be easy. Decades of persecution by coalition authorities have driven the remaining communists of Martinaise underground. They live underground. These communists aren't men. They're mole people. Just between us, you may want to lay off this grind up the bourgeoisie stuff. It's a bit off-putting, even to fellow communists. Possibly. If you have been, it's only because you're a double agent acting in furtherance of your long-term objectives. Listen to this. Do you really think you're the kind of person an underground communist cell would entrust with a mission that requires such discretion? Regardless, what's past is past. You need to look forward to the work of building communism for all. They're not mole people. They're your comrades in the eternal class struggle. It's your task to find and join them. Let your nose guide you, detective. Yes. Fortunately, communists are known to have a very distinct smell. We really have no idea what they're talking about. There's no linkage between ideology and olfaction. Failure. That's why you're perfect for the job. No one's got a better nose for failure than you, Harry. What you're smelling is your own body odor, of course. Nothing a shower and change of clothes couldn't fix.
None of this is edited, by the way. The game literally calls you a smelly failure that wants to murder rich people out of jealousy if you choose communism.
Sure, it may not be apparent at first, but some details come together in a way that does nothing but make communism look awful, because Disco Elysium at large is about how ideology is poison, and extremists, no matter the flag, do nothing but bring misery to the world. They add nothing to others around them, they can only take. And some become so delusional they convince themselves they're the hero of the story, even as they rape and murder. It's something that really does explain a lot of the other elements. If you look at it from the angle of ignore the politics because they just waste time, well, yeah, it's true. Every ideology in the game commits the exact same sins down to the T, from the moralists to the communists to the ultra-liberals. They all do the same thing and just excuse it in different ways. Harry latches onto various ideologies in the game because he's a broken, insane man desperate to reach any shore that will keep him from drowning, beaten down by personal tragedy, and simply dealing with too much from his job as a detective in a district that was particularly violent. Harry isn't actually a political guy, he just latches onto politics in the game as a way to give himself purpose, because without it, without the ideals those politics bring, Harry has nothing beyond the case, the one that only adds to his nightmares and worsening mental state. It's why Harry becomes such a diehard for whatever road you pick, because it's all Harry really has. But all it does is waste time. Every ideology adds no details to the case, or at most you would have already known what they're saying by the time you do it. It's why I said you can beat the game in about 3 days. Technically, no matter what you do, you will always end up beating the game at least 5 days, no matter how fast you are, because you're locked to one region in the city until day 3, and after a story moment, you get a 2-day time skip. So even if you do everything perfectly, you'll always end up with a time skip. Still, the whole point is if you just knuckle down and work the case, what you're on paper supposed to do, you'll beat the game pretty fast. But the reason it locks you to that region in the first 3 days is because it wants you to get lost and explore, to possibly fall into temptation to an ideology and get distracted by that, since there are specific time wasters that absolutely solve nothing. Some just directly make fun of you for picking them. I mean, they all make fun of you, but the ending of certain routes really hammer home the why did you waste time on this vibe. It's why the routes that actually reveal the most about the world and what's going on has absolutely nothing to do with politics. They're completely insane and sound bullshit, not like the real factions in the game, but they're the ones that are digging into the truth. They're not hampered by ideology. They won't throw away information because it comes from an inconvenient source. They want the objective truth. The Schizo route is the one that actually reveals the most about the world, and has an ending that really blows you away. It's full of legitimate wonder and gives a satisfying conclusion to Harry's arc, whatever arc you yourself want it to be. It's why the political routes are so unsatisfying, at least how I see it, because Harry is too hampered down on ideals sold by conmen and murderers to the point he loses sight of true beauty around him. Of course, I think I beat around the bush long enough. Let's actually talk about the case and what happened, because it's a doozy of a mystery. So what kicks everything off is the murder of Ellis Courtenaire. The names in this game are going to be really weird. This is going to be a long-running theme in this video. A mercenary hired to infiltrate the dock owned by Wild Pines, who are currently dealing with a union strike. Out of the blue, he's dead, found lynched in a tree. The obvious assumption is the union did it, as they're literally bragging about the murder and the body is tied up with an industrial strap specifically used by the union. You're forced to deal with the consequences of Harry's binge in the beginning of the game, trying to get him sober enough to examine the body and find a way to get him out of the tree. You can shoot the body out, but it's a tricky shot that basically requires min-maxing hand-eye coordination to get it done, because it's a story element to push you into talking with the union. You meet with the union boss, Everett Sinclair, who barely hides his intentions to you. The man looks, talks, and sounds like a rat.
Harry, I bunked her cabin. I bunked her whole boat. I had cameras surveying her boat. Hell, I even wanted to bug that thermal cap, but my boys advised against it.
It's very clear you're not supposed to trust him, and he ropes you into doing some of his dirty work in order to get the body out of the tree, such as opening doors to intimidate political enemies and pressuring people into signing away their property rights for a real estate scam he's planning. You can also talk with the representative for Wild Pines, Joyce. She's an interesting character, as she contrasts Everard in almost every way. Instead of being locked away in the dock surrounded by violent thugs and shipping containers as a makeshift kingdom, Joyce is right there out in the open, sitting there at the dock on her boat. She's also much more upfront with Harry about the situation, situation. Sure, she's a corporate negotiator, she can't show every card close to her chest, but she's willing to show a lot, and even acts as the introduction to the larger setting. You find out Wild Pines has dealt with this union before, as they've had previous strikes. At first, they're able to actually work things out, and they're able to get pay raises, better benefits, and make things better for all their employees, but now they're completely clamped down. Now, before anything, you can ask her about where you are, the history of the region, and basic concepts of reality. Also, this one weird check that's impossible to pass for now. I mean, that's kind of cool. Still, Joyce is shady, and she flat out admits to you she is shady and needs your help. While Everard seems to be filled with childish glee at the possibility of escalating violence, Joyce is trying to limit the casualties as best as possible. Sure, Wild Pines hired a notorious mercenary group, but Joyce herself remarks that they're out of control and no longer following orders, for reasons you discover later, and really reveal the importance of solving the mystery. All you know is that the Union are on the verge of being put against the wall and shot, literally. The mercenaries want blood and will get it. The analogy Joyce uses is that it's like a wasp barging into a beehive. Even if the bees win, it'll cost too many lives that will go down as a historic slaughter. She also has some suspicions about the strike itself. They've been going for months and show no signs of letting up. They're not running out of money despite squeezing every other business in the city dry to fund them. Also, their demands make no sense. At first, they could work with the union to negotiate better pay and better conditions, all the usual stuff, but now they're just screaming their heads off about all workers and member of the board, an impossible demand even they know can't get done, since it would mean all 2,000 some odd workers in Revachol alone would be consulted anytime the board members want to make policy for the company, disregarding every other port they own. It makes no sense yet the union isn't budging, so you have a brewing retaliation from the mercenaries, and the union is just pretending nothing has changed. You can investigate a lead that shows the union is funding their strike through drug trafficking, using the port to move chemical ingredients for narcotics through the city. When you confront Everard about it, he just laughs you off and says it's all for black market meds, stuff to get to the poor and the unfortunate, and I sincerely hope nobody believed him, because no, that's not why. It's because they're getting money from crime lords to ship them ingredients. It's why drugs, which were already a problem, explodes in Revachol, to the point even children like Kuno are turned into junkies, because while guys like the Hardy Boys insist they have a handle on drugs in the city, all they did was move the prog to Gemrock, which is 20 minutes away, and damn near every character you talk to is a casual drug user. They've done irreparable damage to the city and somehow convinced themselves they did the right thing, which is a very common theme with this union. Yeah, the Union is fucking stupid. This is not up for debate. The Union are a bunch of violent, self-centered, egotistical, hypocritical morons. Except Leo. Leo's just a good dude.
Container, container, I'll turn you nice and red. Container, container, put the logos on.
Still, the Union are the de facto villains of the story. Now, obviously, if you have different socio-political opinions, you might view things differently, but these guys make my skin crawl, because they just barge ahead with zero regard for collateral damage. Hell, sometimes they specifically make plans around there being collateral damage. It's especially bad when you look further into the case. Now, the absolute most incompetent, true dumbasses of the story are the Hardy Boys. I hate these people to levels that cannot be described. The Hardy Boys are the more openly militant faction of the Union, led by Titus Hardy and his brother Angus, though Angus is much more passive. Titus is a foul-mouthed, hyper-aggressive, openly corrupt man that from the word go works to make your life difficult, keeping the other boys in line to prevent them from giving testimony, and openly threatening you for investigating the case. Now you can tell him about the ultra-violent mercenary team that wants revenge for their comrade, but he blows you off, saying the Union has more men and guns. Except the shit the mercs are packing is military grade, and they're experienced killers that joke and laugh about some of the crimes against humanity they get up to. They're simply tougher and scarier, but Titus refuses to budge on the matter, keeping up his peacock tactic in the hopes you go away. And it's especially bad when you do all of Everard's tasks and talk to him. He will lay out, in no uncertain terms, what his plan is. He wants the situation to get violent, for the mercenaries to snap and kill everybody, because then he can use their deaths as propaganda to force Wild Pines out of Revachol. The dock will be property of the Union, and the Union will run it independently. The reason they've been going so long is because Everard was hoping for a violent incident to dangle over the company's head, and the drug trafficking is a double-edged sword he wants to use in order to make them too skittish to gun after the Union. Which kind of ignores the fact the fucking police might look into it, you know? The police who are specifically owned by the moral intern, who don't want the Union to be independent and want to force them back into line, and the mercenary gang still wants blood for their dead man, so they'd be more than gleeful to kill everybody in the Union and call it a day, and it'd be pretty hard to inspire revolution when the stories of your own crimes spread, the murder, corruption, embezzlement, intimidation tactics, and this is basically admitting in no uncertain terms he intends to turn the Union into a cartel, to become a mob boss and the king of his own kingdom. Everard and his brother only really care about liberating Revachol in the sense that their fat asses get to sit on the throne once it's empty.
Sadly, Wild Pines have cooperated with what amounts to a crime syndicate for 2 decades. However much you feed the leech always hungers.
As much as Everett talks about how much he hates Wild Pines and Joyce, he does literally all the same things she does. Organizing murders, paying people off to strike for him. Joyce does openly admit she hired scabs to break down the strike, but I mean, she admits to it. Stalking Harry, the waitress from the Whirling Rags, flat out admits she refused to call the police about the body because she was terrified of the Union. They are a glorified mafia, one that thinks they're freeing the common man while they have their boot on their throats. They're just gangsters. They demand money from local businesses, strangling any economic progress the city could see, and Everett specifically plans around people dying. His own people. He's using the Hardy Boys as the fall guys and plans for them all to die for his war. That's why Titus is so cocky about the situation. He thinks Everett has his back, having his prize student Elizabeth, who Everett outright put through law school to be the Union's lawyer, guide them on how to avoid police custody. And the whole time, Everett's salivating at the idea of this man being strung up just like Ellis.
I had guys recording and processing this information for me. Hell no! They'd fuck it up. They can't do anything right. I mean my real boys. My special task force boys.
Now for a while, you are operating off the idea the Union killed Ellis. The supposed motive was that Ellis raped a woman named Clausier and they killed him in retaliation, which is a pretty big deal that could explain everything. They're admitting to it, Everett's bragging about how it helps him, and the only people with motive would be them, since tensions between the mercenaries and the Union have been terrible since they got there. But there's something not right about the whole thing. If you spec into the schizo-hairy paths, especially, you get strange hunches. Stuff like being able to talk to the body, which gives you cryptic riddles, and some statements that raise an eyebrow.
Love did me in provocapo. It was love all along.
Like that he was killed by communism, or that he seemed to enjoy his moment of death. Made all the more hard to figure out with Harry being an unreliable narrator, but if you keep digging, you'll find some interesting details. A small one being a bullet in his brain. Yeah, Ellis was shot, not hanged, so now every part of the investigation is in a tailspin. He was hit with a breech-loading rifle round and strung up to look like a lynching, so what the fuck is up with that? You can confront the Hardy Boys about it and they get startled, like you weren't supposed to find out. Turns out they covered up the real cause of death. Well, why would they do that? All they did was paint a target on their backs from the mercenaries. They took credit for a murder they didn't commit and just made the situation in Revachol leagues worse. Well, they did it because a woman named Ruby told them to. She's actually the driver for the drug running operation, who was in town when the murder happened and supposedly helped organize the cover-up, since the Hardy Boys had no idea what was going on and just wanted to get Clausier as far away from the mercenaries as they could. It seems like Ruby is the key to everything. Since if her first reaction was to cover up the murder, then she had to have known it was possible for it to occur. Maybe she even orchestrated it, maybe out of personal vendetta, or a favor to Everett, who knows. The point is, Ruby is the one to look for. Well, eventually you do find her, but she has no idea what you're talking about. In fact, she says Clausier was the one who organized the cover-up, and she only fled because Harry was coming to the city. Ruby used to work for a crime boss named La Puta Madre, literally the whore mother or motherfucker, and Harry is supposedly one of his agents. So Ruby assumed the case was his excuse to come to Revachol and murder her. Now you can save Ruby and impacts the ending a bit, but she runs off anyway. If you try to arrest her, she blows her own head off and it don't matter. Besides, I have a reason why I always let her die. Still, it's made clear Ruby didn't do this. So who did? Well, no time to think about that, because right after all this is the Mercenary Tribunal. Yeah, they weren't kidding. They put the Hardy Boys against the wall and raised their guns, because as it turns out, they've been watching your investigation the whole time. Just like how Everett has ears in the city, they do too, and they are pissed at how it's going. They didn't catch the bullet detail, or Ruby's involvement, and they really don't care. They want blood for how their commander was treated. Yeah, Ellis was the fucking commander to the mercenaries. They killed the man who kept them in line. And on top of that, the one leading the tribunal is his fucking brother. Adopted brother, but still, they grew up together and joined the military together. And he's been forced to watch his brother and commander's body rot in a tree, humiliated and laughed at by the Union for over a week. This man is seeing red, and someone is going to die for this. No matter how well you do in this segment, a chunk of the Hardy Boys will die. The ones who for sure die no matter what are Glenn, Fat Angus, and Theo. They will die no matter how well you did or how many answers you uncovered. The only ones you can save for sure are Elizabeth, Shanky, Titus, and Kim, your partner. That's not to say Kim dies, it's just he's too wounded to reach the end game with you. Still, the best ending of the game is only achievable if you kill every single Hardy Boy. You have to fail every check you can, bungle things completely, let them all get torn to pieces. Okay, that's not actually the best outcome. Yeah, you want to save as many of them as you can, but not gonna lie, every single time I play Disco Elysium, I go out of my way to let the Hardy Boys die. I sincerely hate these men. They embody the innate hypocrisy the game addresses. They see themselves as the true law in Revachol. They're the ones keeping the neighborhood together. They're the ones watching out for everyone. You can even pass a passive check where a voice in your head refers to Titus as potential RCM sergeant material.
Not just granite, tightly packed RCM sergeant material. No, he already is a sergeant. That's what you're feeling. He just wasn't sure what you are.
Something that doesn't have the implications I think the developers intended. The Hardy Boys are fucking stupid. They bumbled their way into a murder they had no obligation to cover up, made themselves the target of the mercenaries' wrath, bragged about the murder so that the wrath would only escalate, and talked a big game at how they'd totally win in a confrontation against them, only for them to be put up against the wall where they start pissing themselves in fear. They can't be the neighborhood thugs anymore. They're facing an enemy much, much scarier. It's easy to talk big against two detectives who are specifically trying to avoid violence, but trained killers that want you dead? Of course they finally crack. It's not funny anymore. It's not just shit talking in a bar anymore. Things got very real, very fast. Even Titus, whose entire persona has been a tough-as-nails guy who doesn't blink in a fight, is in a complete panic. Suddenly, all of their tactics don't work. Union solidarity is out the window. No one's coming to defend them. As much as they talk about having more guys, that the Union stands together, they're all brothers, all of Revachol sees them as heroes, suddenly it's just them out there, put against the wall, alone. Because Everard wants them dead. They're in the middle of the ocean and about to get dragged down into the pitch black. It sounds like you want to keep them alive just to spite Everard, and you're not wrong. But there's some major holes with his plan that the game just sort of hopes you ignore. The one thing keeping a total massacre from occurring is the idea that the company still has enough humanity to avoid just wiping the Union off the face of the earth, which is a paradox. How can the company be this evil, amoral beast that stomps on human rights, yet also wants to avoid killing as many people as possible? The entire plan hinged on Joyce convincing the rest of the board members not to declare war, which is not a guarantee, and you even see signs it's not going to work. For one, a full-blown moral intern agent is in Revachol, a guy who directly works for the Coalition. Sure, it's implied he's there because of Clausier, since she's a former Corpo spy who ran away from the life and went into hiding, but you really think he's not watching the situation at large, especially since Everard is planning on snowballing this into larger and larger strikes against the company until all docks are liberated from Wild Pines. The mole intern being in Revachol just shows that they're letting things play out because they know this scheme is fucking ridiculous, thought up by wannabe gangsters drunk off their own influence. Or the idea that, Wild Pines wouldn't just throw him under the bus because he's the guy orchestrating literally everything and admits to it more than once to Harry, who is a detective. They can easily say Everard was the one who did everything and they have no responsibility and he went rogue, which is literally what happened.
Yours takes the retard cake!
And the tribunal serves as a brutal lesson. When you want to play in the big leagues, you get a harsh reminder of what that means. Suddenly, you're not strong-arming cops in a dirty bar, you're thrown against the wall of that dirty bar and have a gun pointed at your head by paramilitaries. Is it ethical? Is it right? Is it something the good guys do? No, but it's like picking a fight with the sunrise. You are never going to win. As much as Everard talks about how he has every variable planned out, he really doesn't. The one thing keeping him breathing is just a moral intern thinking he's not worth the bother of killing. He can play tyrant all he wants in Revachol, who cares? There's multitudes of different solutions to kill him, and he doesn't leave his harbor because deep down, he knows this. He has to stay in the one area he has complete control over, because anywhere else is too dangerous. He's a fat, breathing target. He says, "Oh, I'm too old and fat, it's more fun to stay here," but that's just cope, really. He knows he's a target. He knows the moral intern are watching him, so he just doesn't want to leave. Of course he'd know. He uses their tactics. Bugging rooms, stalking potential troublemakers, keeping a tight circle of loyalists. He uses the Hardy Boys as the public loyalists, but even he refers to them as incompetent. Everard doesn't want people to know who his actual inner circle is, because then they're vulnerable. Their name's on a kill list. They're human beings that can be replaced with other human beings. Some that might not be as loyal to Everard as he wants. It's a very interesting aspect of the story, the sheer delusion that the Union holds about the future. The hypocrisy of saying they're for the common man and openly talking about throwing nameless bodies at a former military in the hopes they can win through attrition. They talk about how great the Union is as a concept, yet even they know they can't win in a fair fight. All their propaganda is bluster. Nobody really wants a war to kick off. Even after the tribunal happens, you notice something interesting. While Everard is swearing it will lead to a war and everything will turn out how he wants, nothing happens. The streets are empty. The harbor is forced to go into lockdown. There's no grand uprising, no forceful ousting of Wild Pines, no mobs in the streets. The Union tucks its tail and runs back to home territory. Sure, it might not happen overnight, but there's just a vibe in the back of my mind that things did not exactly live up to the ideals Everard had in mind. Hell, the commander isn't even punished. If you get the outcome where he lives through the tribunal, he's taken to a former military hospital, with full coverage due to his insurance plan. So it seems like after the tribunal, you're completely fucked. All the potential suspects are dead, you can't really talk to anybody anymore, and you can't even report the shooting to the RCM. Turns out the Union are jamming your communications to hide what happened. Once again, leaning towards the idea Everard was bullshitting and his plan is up in smoke, because if Everard wanted the Hardy Boys dead, why not let the RCM report what happened? If it was to prevent them from getting backup, well, they were a bit too late on that front. There's multiple RCM officers there, and if they're scared of RCM officers showing up, then just imagine a whole platoon of moral intern mercenaries. They'll just break into the harbor and kill everybody there. 2,000 dock workers, more like 2,000 enemy combatants. You can sneak into the dock from a shed behind the bar. These people are gonna die. This whole plot seems like it's made up by a guy desperate to think of himself as a master tactician, and he's not that at all. He has no idea the depths of what he's wading into. And really, there's still a major question left unanswered. Who shot Ellis? We still don't know who actually killed the guy that kicked this whole thing off. Nobody even heard the shot. Claude swears she only heard glass breaking, and none of the Hardy Boys heard gunfire that night, so the shot couldn't have come from the bar itself. Something that's a tad obvious when you examine the bullet and see it's a rifle round, meaning that a sniper did it, but you're forced to operate off a theory that the shot came from the balcony, not one of the Bear story threads, not gonna lie. As stated, this does have some plot holes. The whole thing with Ruby thinking you're working for a crime boss, that literally goes nowhere. I'm not even kidding. That literally goes fucking nowhere. As soon as you raise the question, you get one little tease that maybe Harry is. Then the ending completely shuts that down and goes, no, you would never work for them. So why did Ruby think you're working for a crime boss? And they tease the idea that maybe Harry did work for a crime boss, only for them to pull the rug out from under you and go, no, that's stupid and impossible. At least leave the possibility open, for fuck's sake. If it's going to be such a massive plot point, for the conversation with Ruby. It's especially bad when you examine the ballistics and it just flat out tells you where the bullet comes from. Which of these lines makes the most sense for a shot trajectory? I'll give you a minute. Yeah, it's kind of obvious, ain't it?
The answer is none of them. All intrude on the building next to the bar. And the third one especially is a completely different angle from how the shot came in. Yet it's treated as the right answer.
But I'm willing to chalk this up to smelly Europeans not understanding ballistics, which is saying a lot, because I'm not an expert on it by any means. Regardless, you go to examine Clause's apartment, and she ties a red string pointing out what direction the bullet came from, showing it's an island off the coast of Revachol. That's if you don't arrest her, however. If you do take her in, it's implied she's killed by the moral intern. I never arrest her in my playthroughs, because while she's shady and did some fucked up things in her past, she really isn't involved with the case too much. It's her idea to perform the cover-up lynching, but that's because she was terrified of the moral intern finding her, not wanting to be dragged into a deeper investigation that would expose her presence in Revachol. But she does end up feeling guilty enough to call in the police to report the body, even staying in the city longer than intended as a sort of penance to herself, since she was in a relationship with Ellis and seemed to truly like him. She's a very paradoxical person, helping set up the fake lynching to hide the murder, but also not even bothering to hide details when Harry interrogates her. Sure, she's not forthcoming about everything, but she admits more than enough to let you solve the case. So whether or not you arrest her is how you view her character personally. Is she deserving of punishment, or do you let her go since she's a smaller detail to a larger picture? It's up to you, and lends credence to the idea that you follow your own logic. Still, you're led to the island, an old outpost used by the communist revolutionaries during the war. You can explore the outpost for some more lore, specifically a mattress you can take a nap on that reveals the truth around Harry's ex-fiancée. As stated, their breakup was bad. Bitter enough that Dora, the real name of Harry's lost love, aborted their child and ran off on him, leaving him and starting a new life in a completely different country. She got married to a new guy and even had his child. Harry never got over their last conversation, dreaming it as a warped nightmare over and over again for 6 years straight, even imagining Dora as Dolores Day, a sort of Jesus Christ type figure in the setting. Harry's mind warps Dora to be a literal messiah, an embodiment of beauty, forever tormenting his mind. You also get some revealing details in your conversation with her. Whatever ideology you pick in the game is referenced, as Harry's desperate attempts to persuade Dora to stay, and she just scoffs him off, saying that she left not because of ideology, but because their relationship fell to pieces. They had no money, Harry was getting more depressed, and neither were truly happy. All of his shenanigans in the game were coping mechanisms to make him forget Dora, even training himself to completely black out his memories so he didn't have to think about her anymore. But his subconscious always knew she was there, and you have moments in the game where Harry still pines for her. It's not something you can just forget and pretend never happened. He needs to truly accept she's gone and move on with his life. But that's easier said than done. Still, this is one of the highlights of the game. This scene is truly emotional, and you're given options on how you want Harry to react to Dora. Is he still hopelessly obsessed with her, or will you try and push him towards letting her go and piecing himself back together? It's up to you and how you view Harry. Some like the guy being a loser from start to finish, others want to see him get his shit together and try to become a fully fledged detective again. Regardless, this is the final story moment before the final confrontation. You find a sniper's nest that reveals that this is the island the killer resides at. Having such a clear view of the bar, you could stare into Clausier's bedroom with binoculars if you wanted to. And you finally track down the killer at a campfire, and he's just an old man.
Regressive bourgeoisie henchman. Can't even talk like a grown-up.
This is Dross, a former communist revolutionary that's been living all alone on this island for over 40 years. He is exceptionally bitter about you finding him, about the world, about just everything. Dross is a man consumed by misery. He barely even hides the fact he's the one who shot Ellis, proudly displaying the gun and lamenting the failure of the revolution. It seems like he's a diehard communist that killed Ellis as a political statement. He's been watching Revachol for decades, so he's well aware of the Union strike and arrival of the mercenaries. Ellis and his unit were infamous in the city for being abusive and violent, so it appears Dross performed a vigilante murder, shooting Ellis in the mouth as he was having sex with Clausier. It appears everything is tied together with a nice big bow. But something doesn't seem right. It seems kind of small for an explanation. This old man shot Ellis for shits and giggles? What's up with that? Well, that's because there is a large dialogue tree that's not here. You see, when you examine Clausier's apartment, you can pass a perception check. Harry finds a dry maybell flower on the balcony. Maybells in the lore were used by lovers to give to each other before the men went off to war, a sign that they would always care for each other, something like that. But specifically, they were used by communists during the revolution. Not only that, but you discover a secret compartment in the Whirling Rags, the remains of a pinball arcade that went bankrupt some time ago, and in that pinball arcade, there's an elevator. There's an entire back room to the balcony not even Clausier was aware of. And there's footprints in the dust made very recently. Even a peephole in the wall that lets someone spy in her apartment. At first, it's safe to assume she's being watched by the moral intern. She does have people trying to kill her. But no, it's not them. It's Dross. He's been using that back room to stalk Clausier. Not out of hatred, at least not fully. He seems like he's in love with her, watching from his nest day in and day out. Now when I say love, take it in a much more insidious interpretation. He doesn't actually care about Clausier. It's a more obsessive and envious form of affection, really similar to how Titus felt about her. At first glance, there seemed to be actual connection and respect for her. Then she does something they don't like, and they have to contain themselves not to just go up there and beat her lifeless. Titus has to be talked down by Elizabeth not to do literally this when you reveal she tore apart their rape story.
No, we just fucked. That's all. Relationship? There was no fucking relationship. He raped her. That's their relationship.
Something is off here. His anger is possessive.
Okay, enough. All of this is irrelevant to your stated investigation.
Yeah, whatever. Fuck! I knew that fucking whore couldn't be trusted.
You've hit a nerve. Titus is furious. No, more than that. The loyal Titus feels betrayed.
For the record, Titus Hardy did not explicitly specify the victim as a whore, nor did he say anything about trusting her.
Oh, shut up and stay out of this, Liz. He raped her. He was out of his fucking mind. You have no idea.
She's just in denial, asshole. You don't understand the traumatic experience. She's shutting down, and she doesn't fucking trust you.
Yeah, she's crazy, you know. A crazy bitch. You know the type. She's fucked up.
This is a diversion. Stay on track.
She wasn't raped. The witnesses' statements were very clear.
Lawman, I'm at the end of my goddamn rope with you. I fucking told you not to push her.
They go from talking about Klaasje like a friend or a ward they need to protect to casually calling her a whore or a crazy bitch that can't be trusted, showing how fast they're willing to cut someone out once they are slighted. They don't even know the context behind why she denied the story, whether it's being cornered or if she was never comfortable with claiming to begin with. As she had a sexual relationship with the victim that never seemed to cross any lines she wasn't personally comfortable with. Titus is the one pushing the rape story, and it's very obviously painted by his own personal bias and possessive mentality around Clausier.
There's a common theme with Clausier. She just seems to bring out the worst in people. They just lean on doing the worst possible things in her presence. Even Harry isn't immune to it, outright having skill checks to just hit on her out of the blue. It's not like a supernatural power or anything like that, more just, it's what happens when she's with people. Ironically, the one person who didn't do this was Ellis himself. In public, he's boasting about killing civilians and being a total monster, but with Clausier, at least according to her, he became much more vulnerable and honest about himself. He was completely destroyed mentally by war, turned from a scared and starving orphan into a killing machine. The one person who didn't become worse around her was the guy already there to begin with. It might even be why they connected in the first place. They just clicked due to their mutual natures. Still, the point being that Dross became obsessed with Clausier, and when he learned of her relationship with Ellis, he became enraged. Going from affection to outright hatred for them both. He shot Ellis while him and Clausier were having sex, specifically to punish her, to traumatize her and get his revenge on her. That's what caused all of this. All of the violence, death, and tragedy. A lonely old man who killed another man over a woman he never knew, never spoke with, and didn't even know her name, all out of his own hatred and misery. Dross is a pathetic character. Every single descriptor for him is pathetic. He has no friends, no loved ones, no connection to anybody, anywhere, all alone, drunk off his own ideology, and nothing to keep him company. He despises art, seeing it as bourgeoisie nonsense. He despises people, seeing them as traitors and whores sold out to the moral intern capitalists. He despises other communists, seeing them as non-dedicated posers that aren't willing to fight and die for the cause. Even if you spec into communist Harry route, he'll spend the entire conversation criticizing you for not being communist enough for his liking. And most of all, Dross hates himself. Because this isn't some weathered soldier keeping up the fight after all this time. Dross is a coward and a deserter. During the invasion of Revachol, he deserted his unit and hid while they were getting slaughtered, coming out of hiding to realize the war was lost and all of his comrades were dead. Dross then runs off into the island, spending decades stewing in his rage and taking it out on various people in Revachol. He could have potentially murdered dozens of people we just don't know about. Revachol is a particularly rough city. How many murders are unaccounted for? Between the RCM's thin resources and the Union covering things up, especially when you find out the connection between Everard and Dross. He used him as his hitman to kill the former Union head and put himself in the seat, having her shot the day of the election and strong-arming anyone who wanted to investigate. And that's just the murder Dross was willing to talk about. There could be more bodies the story just doesn't bring up. He still sees himself as a true revolutionary, the only real communist left alive. And he's just this nihilistic old hitman who got cucked by a drug addict mercenary. There are people who say they think Dross is the coolest character in the story, and my question is, how? How is this guy cool? Every detail about him makes him despicable. He deserted his unit and yet has the gall to say everyone else isn't committed enough to the fight. He's obsessively stalking a woman he never met and wanted to get petty vengeance on her when she shacked up with a guy he didn't like. Kicked off a powder keg situation that ended with mercenaries shooting a bunch of uninvolved bystanders. Something he blames you for.
Of course you got those boys killed.
That it was your fault for not saving people, he got killed with his actions. Opinions on the Hardy Boys aside, it is fully 100% Dross's fault they were put up against the wall and shot in the first place for killing Ellis. He committed the murder, yet he blames you, because you didn't personally save them. This is who Dross is. He does something terrible and then blames everyone else for it, even the way he words it. Clausier deserves to be traumatized for life because she slighted some crazy old man she didn't even know existed. But when Dross deserted his unit, you wanna know what he did? He wrote a criticism for himself.
I wrote a criticism of myself and resumed partisan duties.
He left his friends behind to die, and his response is that he wrote an essay about how he felt bad about it. And to make it all worse, Dross isn't even a soldier. In fact, he's insulted at the very notion. Sure, he's trained to shoot a gun, but he refers to himself as a political commissar. This was an actual position in the Soviet Union. It refers to an official from the Communist Party who was assigned to a military unit to make sure they upheld communist principles. This guy was a glorified health inspector for communists. He's not a soldier. It's why he abandoned his unit when shit took a turn for the worse, because all he was good for was spouting ideological talking points.
Commissars were infamous for shooting their own men for disloyalty. The Finns during the Winter War outright printed propaganda posters showing this happened to dissuade people from joining the communists, essentially warning them that they will be shot by their own commander on a whim. Now, in the beginning, executions were handled by the NKVD. Who ran the actual death squads in the Soviet Union and the gulags, but these were phased out as World War II progressed and commissars were allowed to execute their fellow soldiers. Since the NKVD were seen as redundant, still, it was well known that executions were handled by both groups. The only real difference is that the NKVD were considered a separate entity from the army.
For all of his talk of solidarity and loyalty, he never had an ounce of it himself. He calls the dead his brothers, but he never gave two shits about them. It's to justify his hatred. He's not angry his friends were killed. He's angry the revolution failed. The revolution he deserted from. On top of that, it's even implied he wasn't even a frontline guy until the very end of the war, saying he was pulled up due to emergency defense protocols. Now, they do acknowledge the fall of Revachol was his first battle, since he was recruited in 07 and was stationed there in 08, so a year of training and his first deployment being the end of the war, and he did never formally finish his training. But that's not much better, since once again it means an entire year was wasted on training a commissar that immediately deserted. The guy who was supposed to embody strict loyalty to ideology ran away as soon as he could. So he was a fucking pogue. Dross is just a horrible person, a hypocrite that wants to judge everyone else for behaviors he does without a second thought, which is actually pretty common among communists now that I think about it. You can even get him ranting about people he despises around Revachol, which is pretty much everyone. Women, kids, any random stranger he can see. As stated, he doesn't see these people as individuals. He thinks all of them are traitors for moving on from the revolution. He's angry they aren't throwing themselves into machine guns for the struggle he himself ran away from, and in particular, he hates a man called Rene. Now, Rene is a very interesting character. He basically represents old school fascism. He's a former royalist soldier who fought in the revolution for the other side, on the side of the king. He brags about the strength of the royal family and has nothing but disdain for communists. In fact, he's willing to give you any information he has about the murder, he just doesn't have any to give. You'd think the game would make him a complete joke, a crotchety old grandpa that talks about the good old days and dreams of burning crosses, especially considering the game's supposedly biased towards communism. But that's actually not the case. Rene is one of the best characters in the game. You don't get a lot of details about him, but he's very fleshed out as a human being. Instead of being a parody, Rene is basically the polar opposite of Dross. Not just politically, but in literally every single way. While Dross was a commissar, Rene was an actual soldier. He fought on the front lines, even winning decorations for bravery. Not only that, but he was crippled saving a commanding officer. The cousin to the king the whole unit hated because he was basically incompetent. Rene, despite also hating him, had his knee broken pulling the man to safety. While he lost his jaw, the man survived and held Rene in high regard for the rest of the war.
He was the commanding officer and I was on duty. Just doing my job. Shouldn't hand out medals for that. 13 months later, I received the Sun for distinguished service. It's not worth mentioning.
He also has friends. Rene is always seen playing ball with another old man in the city, and the two are legitimately best friends, growing up together and staying in touch for over 80 years. Rene is still living in Revachol. He's still a part of the city, its people. He even works as a security guard for the Union. He absolutely hates the Union and how shady they are, but he puts his opinions aside to make a living. You even find out he loved a woman, engaged to a childhood friend he sadly had to leave to go fight in the war, where she was promptly stolen by his best friend. But since the three were together since childhood, she couldn't commit to either man. In fact, they all had a running joke she was basically married to both of them, though Rene obviously is still bitter about that memory. He did truly love her.
It already got ugly nearly 80 years ago when the three of us were just learning to walk and talk.
You stole her from me.
Well, technically, you stole her from me, because we'd been pretty close ever since you two had that falling out over the ink you spilled over her pretty yellow dress.
We were just boys then. This was different. You No point starting this all over again. For the 1000th and the first time. Especially when we have company.
When she died, the two of them grieved her, and when Rene later dies of a heart attack, his best friend is grieving his loss as well. Rene had an impact in the world. He had people who cared that he was there and enjoyed his presence in spite of his attitude. Dross, on the other hand, has none of these things. In fact, he seems to have a particular hatred for Rene for all of this. He talks about how much he wanted to shoot Rene, that he was saving him for a special occasion, but he just watched him. For decades. In fact, when you tell him that Rene died of a heart attack, Dross breaks down, it ends the dialogue tree, and he can't even broach the subject again. Rene was admired even by a mortal enemy, who can't accept the idea that the last symbol of his struggle just died of a heart attack, an old man content with his life. Whether or not it was admiration or jealousy, I don't know, but Dross couldn't shoot Rene for some reason. Probably because he just couldn't accept the idea the one true fascist he hated had a better life than him, had everything Dross threw away and just refused to ever get back. Rene didn't waste his life in ideological hatred, living on an island all by himself. I hope you guys are realizing why I say this game isn't as sympathetic to communism as parts of the fanbase would have you believe. In fact, a lot of the communist characters in the game are pretty horrendous human beings. They're murderers, stalkers, and plain and simple just thugs. They're hypocrites using all the same tactics as their enemies, yet judging them for it. They steal money, strong-arm people, ruin entire communities, then have the gall to say everyone else isn't doing enough to make things better.
Gary, the crypto-fascist, isn't even targeted for his political beliefs. Everard gladly works with Measure Head, who is also considered a fascist due to his beliefs, and he takes it a step further by being the violent enforcer guarding the way into the harbor. An avowed racial supremacist, willing to attack people on the Union's orders. It's essentially like hiring a neo-Nazi gang for security. The only reason Gary is targeted is because he is investigating Everard's drug ring, putting himself at risk solely because he knows it's wrong and is destroying the neighborhood. Another case of the fascist straw man being a better person than the supposedly puffed up communists.
Now I know some of you guys are going, well, what about the communist students? Aren't they a good example of communism? To that I'll say, sure, at first. They seem to be just two dumb college students that got wrapped up in communism and are tackling it with all the zeal of a 20-something-year-old who thinks they figured out how the world works. But there's some nefarious implications with them. For one, they speak in buzzwords. Their language are just terms they pulled from books they've read and with no actual definition to them.
One thing you learn quickly at university is that you're not going to find a real education in any lecture hall or discussion seminar.
We are post-attendance, basically.
Dropouts.
Harry has to outright pass checks not to drift off in boredom because he has no idea what they're talking about. And as you talk to them, they discuss the history of communism in the region. It was literally intended to be a replacement for religion, taking the zealotry and refocusing it away from eternal salvation and instead on making a better world. The game compares communism to a religion, and the fanbase expects you to think of this as a good thing, because with the religion comparison dropped, you now have to address the elephant in the room, the revolution, where every side were fucking animals to each other and did terrible things. With the mindset this was intended as a spiritual war, the communists are now a different beast altogether. This isn't just political factions fighting, this was a war of zealotry forcing itself on the rest of the world. A cult collapsed the royal family and forced everybody into a commune, one that tried to build a nuclear reactor in a major city and ended up causing Chernobyl, by the way, reaffirming that communists can't even boil water correctly. They violently overthrow a nation, talk about how all of mankind needs to follow their religion, and they were shocked the coalition stomped them down. And if you actually listen to what the students are saying, they are insane. One of them even drops hints that they want to perform another revolution.
But that doesn't mean we can simply give up, especially then.
And of course, we'll be shooting right back.
Even more death and suffering for something doomed to fail. They even oust one of their members for saying, hey, not every idea from the capitalists is a bad thing. Their methods around fucking crop rotation sound like a good thing to follow.
It was unbelievable. He said, turnips don't care if they are grown by communists, moralists, or Vulcan. They grow just the same.
Basically, he was rejecting the whole foundation of inframaterialist theory.
Yeah, they threw the guy out for saying you should farm your crops correctly, because he wasn't thinking of things with an inframaterialist lens. What is inframaterialism? The power of belief. I'm not even joking.
Simply that under suitably revolutionary conditions, crop yields naturally increase relative to non-revolutionary crops, which Morris somehow has the gall to deny.
It's the idea of putting so much faith into something they manifest it into reality. So their idea, after the global revolution, is to throw out all the documented methods to farm crops and just believe they can grow turnips. This is how the Holodomor started, you fucking morons. The big thing with the students is that they're trying to build a tower out of matchboxes and use their belief in inframaterialism to keep it standing, since it's built in a way that's guaranteed to fall apart. It's this whimsical moment where it looks like this time it's gonna work. You can get the ball rolling on true You know what? Fitting. Now, if you fully spec into communism, the end of the quest line is the tower stays up. Fans say that this is proof communism is possible, but this relies on turning Harry into a communist zealot, a mentally unstable man willing to work with murderers and thieves, turned into a zealot that thinks he can grow turnips through the power of belief.
The tower collapses at the end anyway, and the main student comes up with the excuse that it was supposed to happen, so they should believe that's why it fell, essentially demanding they rewrite history so he can keep up his ideological delusions.
Now, some of you guys might be going, hey, wait a minute. What about the Pale? Couldn't that affect the material world? To those unaware, I brought up a borderline impossible check earlier in the video. You can ask Joyce that something in the world doesn't feel right. You can't say what, but Harry just instinctively knows there's something out there. And there is. The Pale is an indescribable force in the setting. It's this kind of gray cloud or force or whatever it is that just seems to affect all natural laws. History blends together, the human mind is thrown into every memory all at once. In the deepest layers of the Pale, concepts like numbers stop working. You get signs of the Pale spreading in Revachol, in the church where a hole in reality blocks all sound, the doomed commercial area where every business that opens up there goes bankrupt regardless of what happens, even a mysterious phone number playing a call from over 100 years ago. Lorry drivers experience regular Pale exposure, and Ruby makes a device that attempts to harness the Pale and use it as a weapon. There's even a cargo container in the dock that's used by a billionaire, whose face warps light around him. The guy is a walking, talking beacon of the Pale. Now, the game tries to say something else about the guy, that he just has so much money that reality is breaking down around him, because it feeds into the communist student thing, but I'd hedge a safer bet that since he travels around a lot, he's been exposed to the Pale so much his physical body is now a beacon for it. Still, the Pale seems to imply that there is a force out there that can manifest true communism, that turnips will grow and the tower stays up this time. But that's not how that works. Inframaterialism relies on everyone putting their faith into the idea it will work. So what do you do with the people that are more skeptical, like the guy asking about turnips? For a small-scale book club, they just boot him out from the group. But what about a larger scale, a town, or a nation? That's millions of people potentially, all of which need to be putting complete faith in the idea that these ideas will work. If something goes wrong, buildings collapsing or crops failing, who's the first to be blamed? The people who didn't believe hard enough. A purity spiral will begin to weed out the ones who aren't showing complete loyalty to the idea of communism. There's even hints of it in the dialogue. The two students write articles for a communist newspaper bankrolled by the Union. In it are articles denouncing things like car races as bourgeoisie exploitation, something that Kim outright mentions. It's very obvious they've never even set foot in a car.
I can imagine. Something tells me there's not exactly a glut of young communists itching to write about tip-top for La Fumée. If I had to wager, I'd say they've never even seen the inside of a motor, much less a motor race. I take whatever they write with a large grain of salt.
But the point is, they say these must be banned. You can't even enjoy car races in these two dipshits' perfect world. You can't enjoy art, you can't enjoy sports, you're just forced to put unending, unyielding loyalty to the idea of communism. You can't be human. So the obvious question remains, what about family? One of the students says that he's a communist because he wants a better world for his mother, but right there, he has a distraction. He's not putting unyielding faith into communism. He's putting faith into the idea that things will get better for his family. If something goes wrong and the purity spiral begins, he's immediately a target. Why was he thinking of his mother? Why wasn't he thinking of everyone's mother? Why isn't he more loyal? Is he really so preoccupied with his own family that he wasn't thinking of the greater good? This isn't a point I grabbed out from under Everard's massive fat ass. This is something that actually happened. During both Stalin and Mao's rise to power, the two encouraged children to report their parents to the state if they showed signs of discontent. They tore apart the idea of familial loyalty solely so their people would only worship them. You can't enjoy anything under communism. You can't think about anything under communism. Only endless, undying obsession with the system. Which at that point, what the fuck even are you? A drone. A worker ant denied your own individuality by assholes who swear up and down that they freed you from your shackles, which they say as they're locking the chains right around your own neck. It's disgusting. It completely denies your own humanity. You might say this is an overreaction, that this is just them encouraging you to see things through a Marxist lens. Oh, sorry, I meant Mazovian lens. But that lens is saying these things are bad and should be removed from society. It's saying you can grow turnips if you just believe they will grow, and adding water and sunlight to the crop is just the capitalist propaganda made to enslave you. The religion comparison really is a smoking gun in a lot of ways, because it reveals the communists in the game to be shameless zealots. Their god is the commune, their sin is reactionary responses, apostates of the bourgeoisie. Hell, Dross is basically a priest, just one that spouts communism instead of religion. It promises eternal salvation in the form of a better world, while also saying the struggle is never ending until the entire planet is spouting their doctrine. It's an ideology of slavery and conquest, under the guise of humanitarianism and liberation. And the whole time, you have men like Everard killing anyone who gets in his way and turning the city into a cartel state. Wild Pines and the Coalition aren't the heroes by any definition, but that doesn't mean for a second the Union or Dross are any better. They're exactly as bloodthirsty and nihilistic, something actually touched upon in the game. After the revolution, the Pale across the world grew larger. It's still continuing to grow larger. The way society fought off the Pale in the beginning was by building places of worship, churches, since they would give people spiritual fulfillment and allowed for humanity to stave off the Pale, since that's what it is. Human nihilism, entropy incarnate, the collective conscience of mankind made manifest in the form of a nightmarish entity that destroyed the very universe around it. The communists say their ideology is the only one that can stop the Pale. If you read the novel the lead developer wrote that takes place in the same universe as the game, it flat out says the way to stop the Pale is communism. But that's ridiculous, that book sucks ass, don't use side material to justify lore in a game. Every ideology promises a better future. All of them. Communists say it will come from a grand collective working together. Capitalists say it's from self-governance, to allow the individual to be the master of their own fate. Fascists say it's from the collective becoming stronger as a nation. They're all selling the same product, just different terms for it all. And it's not like communism have a united ideology anyway. I already discussed the possibility of a purity spiral. Well, the game itself shows that you can't get them all together to just collectively believe in inframaterialism. Manana, a guy who works for the Union and is implied to be a communist, is loyal to the Union. The one ran by a corrupt mob boss and is seen as a disgusting parody by Dross. Dross himself doesn't think anyone but him is a communist. Everyone else are just posers stealing the label. Cindy the Skull is an antisocial anarchist who doesn't give two shits about any idea of a collective good. And Everard is only interested in making sure he gets to sit on the throne at the end of the day. Now, some people might shoot back and go, well, Everard isn't technically communist, he's socialist, there's a difference. To which I say, not really. He's bankrolling a strictly communist newsletter. He worked with Dross, an avowed communist. Dross tried to teach him communist doctrine. There's really not much of a difference here, it's just two different terms that all mean the same definition. And it doesn't change the fact that he absolutely intended to have his fellow comrades killed for his own agenda. That's what he intended to do with the Hardy Boys. This is supposed to be an ideology of togetherness, and not one of the communists show any signs of actually doing that. All the college students do all day is read Marxist, I meant Mazovian, literature, and talk about how everyone except them are just bad communists, doing the exact thing that turned Dross into a psychotic, homicidal loner. The ideology is about shutting out all doubt, showing unending loyalty, and nobody's actually ever done that, because it's impossible. We're human beings, we're social animals, we have our likes, our dislikes, our families, our connections, the things that keep us from becoming the slaves they want you to be. When the ideology specifically says that art itself is a bourgeoisie invention and must be thrown out, Dross outright says artists should be sent to a gulag and shot.
Art is a bourgeois establishment. It's an affront to humanity. Every gallery should be bulldozed, and the artists should all be given 30 years of hard labor in Yakuza.
That should be the immediate sign this is all bullshit. Art is what makes us what we are. More than just dumb apes duking it out on a massive ball. Art is how we find out more about ourselves, how we view the world, our place in it. It's something not even the communists could rectify. The Soviet Union had art. They had painters, musicians, even video games and films. Their state tried to turn them all into propaganda films, but there were artists that specifically bucked against that and wanted to make art for art's sake. That's where you get movies like Stalker or The Hand, which had pointed criticisms about the Soviet government and its demands to make art solely as a sign of loyalty. Also, look into how the Soviet government fucked over the creator of Tetris. It's a story that will boil your blood. Disco Elysium, to me, is a game about the failures of communism. Not just the effects it has on the world, but why it always fails. Because it demands human beings to stop being human, to put aside our biases, our connections to the world, and blindly put total faith into an ideology. to the point even members of it refer to it being like a religion. That's impossible and is doomed to fail, whether from sheltered intellectuals criticizing and subverting everything to the point they call turnip farmers capitalist propagandists, or the downright evil and criminal that view others around them as obstacles and have no qualms killing if it means they get what they want. And honestly, the most heartfelt moment of the game has nothing to do with politics. There's a side quest that at first seems like a complete joke. You meet a nice lady in the whirling rags who talks about how her and her husband are cryptozoologists, scientists who look for mythological creatures in the hopes of finding new species of animals. The game mocks you relentlessly for following this, from the voice in your head saying it's not real, to Kim, to the side quest not producing any results. They are looking for what's known as the Insulindian phasmid, a type of stick bug rumored to be native in Revachol. As stated, the game talks to you like you're an idiot for thinking any of this is true, for asking about cryptids and showing any sign you might believe the phasmid exists. Well, at the end of the game, when talking with Dross, you notice something is wrong with him. He's twitching, and is still energetic despite living for decades on this island and dealing with cancer. You can pass a few perception checks to figure out what's going on. Something is keeping him going. Not quite a puppet on strings, but more like a toy with an old pair of batteries in it. And then you discover it. The phasmid is real. It's fucking real. The island Dross has been staying on all this time contains the only living Insulindian phasmid. Not only can you see it, you can talk to it. Harry can pass a check that allows him to psychically communicate with the phasmid. Now, the phasmid is basically like a child. Despite living for centuries, seeing the different stages of history Revachol's been through, it's very innocent, only caring enough to eat leaves and not much else.
I think we should eat it. If it's a leaf, you can put it in your mouth. Or read. Yum yum.
You can talk to it about existence and deeper questions about everything. The phasmid's outright scared of blinking because it thinks it might wipe reality away. It's a genuinely beautiful moment, something that serves as a sort of true ending for the game, realizing that this creature is still alive and even able to communicate. You even get answers to some smaller questions, like where certain items ended up that you couldn't find in the main campaign, even establishing that the phasmid emits a sort of neurotoxin. It's harmless to humans for the most part, but long-term exposure can rot your mind, which is what happened to Dross. Exposure to the phasmid made him far more impulsive and rage-filled, taking his bitterness up a notch into outright manic anger. That's not to say it's the phasmid's fault this all happened. It has no idea it has that effect on humans, and it takes decades for it to develop. All it really did was enhance the traits Dross already had. He already despised the world and the people in it. The toxin from the phasmid just made him lose impulse control. He would have been fine if he simply didn't live alone on an island for over 40 years. Still, the phasmid is a fantastic reveal, showing that even a world as bleak and tired as Disco Elysium still has potential for true wonder. Who knows what else is out there? One day there could be even more species discovered. Maybe humanity can find true answers for the Pale. Maybe we can throw all the communists into it so we don't have to deal with their stupid book clubs anymore. It's just a big world ripe for exploration. Still, then you get the actual ending of the game, the debriefing. After the events on the island, Harry and Kim come back and are confronted by Harry's old team, his partner, a fellow officer from the unit, and a police psychologist. They run down everything you did, from discovering the truth behind the case to side quests. The big goal is to convince your former partner, a man named Jean, to let you back to the unit. Personally, I kinda wanted there to be an option where Harry gives these people the finger and quits because Jean is a massive asshole. Yeah, he's burned out from dealing with Harry's mental breakdown, but the man contributed absolutely fucking nothing to the case. Harry, a man they know is mentally unstable, was left to handle everything, and they had the gall to judge him based on his performance. Even after the tribunal, when him and Kim are fucking shot and left wounded, the two were left to patch themselves up while they didn't even go visit them, even though they were in the city. They were literally in the same bar as them.
No. A man and a woman sit in the front seat of an armored motor carriage. The woman is driving. The man lights a cigarette. Jean Vicmer is his name. The asphalt vanishes under the wheels of the machine. Ahead, harbor cranes rise to the sky. Back to that shithole, he says.
I called your station after the fight. The injury was logged in. They told me they've sent officers to join you on the site. I'm sure they're worried about you.
That means he hasn't seen them around while you were out. They're not really worried about you. If they were, wouldn't they be here?
Yeah, such great friends. Fantastic. Totally not a piece of shit thing to do. There's being tired of dealing with a guy in a downward spiral, then there's setting his yard on fire and complaining he didn't reimburse the cost of gasoline. Still, it's a sort of final boss of the game, to convince them Harry is still good enough to be a detective, and if you did everything right, you're allowed back on. As stated, I kinda wanted a I don't even want to come back ending. Would fit the fact Harry's burned out and has just seen too much. Maybe some variations depending on the style of cop you did, like an art cop becomes a critic or a successful author, I don't know. Regardless, that's Disco Elysium. It's been a while since I made a video about a game, and I hope this one lives up to the hype. Reminder, the playthrough I did was just a singular one. There's so much detail hidden inside that you could waste weeks trying to find them all. The studio behind the game ended up being a lightning in a bottle situation, making something absolutely fantastic and still debated back and forth to this day. I recommend you all sit down and give Disco Elysium a chance. Even if you have serious disagreements with the developers' politics, which I understand if that's material people will just outright raise a finger towards and go fuck you, I laid out in this video how I heavily disagree with their intended audience, but still find myself enjoying the game immensely. Besides, the studio was bought out by the publisher and all the developers were fired, so even if you buy the game, they're not getting any money, which is both a fitting ending for the studio and a tragedy. Very clearly, not every developer was a communist. I really recommend you guys check out that documentary and see how many people got roped into this whole thing. And it sucks they all got smeared by an egomaniac who revealed to be a total hypocrite. All he did was get a bunch of his communist friends from a far-left podcast to voice act. Really, that was the extent of it. He claimed he wrote half the fucking game, and there were tons of developers that came out and said, no, he's lying. And some moments of the game really feel like a hidden fuck you to the guy, because some of this was so blatant, it's honestly astonishing anyone could miss it. And I must repeat that the actual story that happened with Studio Zom fits so well to the themes of the game, just not the way anyone thought. Right now, the fanbase is fucking livid at the news that there's even more layoffs going on in Studio Zom, along with a cancelled sequel and expansion pack for the original Disco Elysium. And it's something to where they're getting so angry that they're blaming literally everyone else. It's a thing where People Make Games was blamed even at the time for being biased with their research, even though if you watch the documentary, they really weren't. They did lay hard into individuals that deserved it, and they simply explored claims that nobody else wanted to look into, such as Kurvitz and his mistreatment of fellow employees, something the fanbase has downplayed to a degree that's honestly kind of disgusting. I mean, you have stories of a guy who's mentally abusing his employees and forcing them to crunch, and the whole time he's barely working himself, and the response is, well, he's the creator and this is his vision. Any other company and any other individual, they'd be writing screed after screed about how this is mistreatment and just the capitalist system at work abusing people, but because it's a communist and now out of nowhere, well, these are just the growing pains to make great art, even though he's doing all the things that they themselves hate. And the idea that People Make Games were responsible for what's going on with the studio now is just stupid. All they did was release a documentary that revealed that these people were not exactly as leftist as they would have you believe. In fact, they were all over the place, disorganized, and didn't seem to really like each other. The idea that a single documentary would affect anything at the company is honestly pretty revealing. Now, they've tried to pull out a quote from Argo Tulik, where he essentially claims that the documentary did in fact affect the company and it allowed the venture capitalists to purge even more of the workforce, to which I say, how would a single documentary do that? And obviously this is a process that's been in the works for a long time. Also ignoring the fact that the games industry all around has been suffering from massive layoffs from company to company. Studio Zom obviously would not be immune to this. So once again, blaming People Make Games for this just kind of feels like Cope. You know, the one kid that spoils everything by pointing out what actually happened, and they have to beat him down so they can still live in their delusion that this was a purely Marxist game and there was never any infighting, and it's just capitalism destroying art. Who cares if Kurvitz did some shady and illegal things himself, because, well, he's a Marxist, and what he's fighting for is so important that you can look past those things. But everyone else, the investors, they're terrible because they're capitalists. So when they do shady and illegal things, you have to point that out. Once again, it's a double standard, something that I've pointed out throughout the game is actually kind of woven into the writing, that the Marxism and ideology aspect is all just puff pieces, and people deep down show you who they really are.
Actually, it appears the Argo quote was completely taken out of context. He went on to clarify on Twitter that he doesn't blame People Make Games in the slightest for his firing. In fact, he praised the documentary and said it meant a lot to the developers of Disco Elysium, who were overshadowed by the slap fight between Kurvitz, his friends, and the executives, even calling it the one good thing that happened to them in 2023.
I doubt for a second that the more radical aspects of the Disco Elysium fanbase will ever have any form of introspection. In fact, they'll just double down and continue to blame everyone but themselves for why the game flopped. They decided to tout the game as a communist masterpiece, and they were shocked that the general public didn't really support it enough or even really care when Studio Zom was shut down. Because remember, to certain parts of the world, communism is the exact same thing as the Nazis. So when they hear about Studio Zom, an openly communist game studio being shut down, They basically view it the same thing as the ethnic cleansing studio being shut down. To them, it's nothing but a net positive for the world because their poison can no longer spread. Now once again, Disco Elysium is a lot more than the communism, but that's what the fanbase wanted to push, so now they get to suffer the consequences. And the whole time they'll still be purity spiraling and blaming everything else beyond their own actions. That's the problem with a lot of gaming today. Very little will people actually sit down and play through something. They tend to rely on YouTube videos, just explain things to them. Certain franchises especially struggle with this. It's just plain sucks to be a Persona fan right now because how many video essays completely miss the point of certain plot elements, and millions of people have vastly different views of the game than was actually there, and I'm sure certain fans of Disco Elysium will probably say the same thing about this video. Regardless, I think it's about time to wrap things up. This video ended up being kind of a monster, though it definitely needed to be. This is a very big game, and just the little bit I talked about requires a lot of context. I didn't even go into all the political quests and how even those have multiple endings. Still, hopefully this gives you guys a new perspective on Disco Elysium. If even a capitalist pig like me can find tons of enjoyment in it, there's very clearly something there for anyone to appreciate. Until next time, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. See you guys.
Especially in light of his political views. Detective Dubois is, as you may know, a hustler. He grinds. He makes the real. He's a visionary and a money engineer, which is just other still. He is also a Mazovian socio-economist who believes in liquidating the ruling class. How he reconciles these 2 points of view, I do not know, but he is vocal on both of them.
Hey loser, do you want a shirt? Do you want a t-shirt? I have shirts now. Look in the description for a link to a t-shirt you can buy. If you don't buy the t-shirt, I'll kill your family. If you don't buy the t-shirt, I'll poison your dog. If you don't buy the t-shirt, you're going to be the only person in town that does not have a t-shirt. Everyone's going to look at you funny. There's going to be social consequences to not having one of these t-shirts. I'm now making express threats of violence against you if you do not buy my t-shirt. I will call the police, tell them how you're not buying my shirt. They're going to plant crack in your house, and they're going to arrest you and then beat you up in a jail cell. Buy my shirt.